The train whistle was a ghost, and I was the one it left behind. The last of its steam dissolved into the bitter Montana air, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a blanket of snow. I stood on that wooden platform, my worn carpet bag feeling like it was full of rocks, each one a failed hope. The few other passengers who'd gotten off in this dusty speck of a town had melted away, swallowed up by waiting wagons and warm hugs. No one came for me. Again. I sank onto a splintered bench, the cold seeping right through my thin coat. My gloved fingers, trembling, pulled out the letter. The paper was soft as cloth, folded and unfolded so many times the creases were about to give way. Harlan Cololton, that was the name. I have a quiet home, a warm hearth, and a place for a kind soul to belong. The words had been a lifeline. Now they were just ink on a page, a lie I'd let myself believe. From the corner of my eye I saw them, two young men leaning against a barrel, their faces half hidden by their hat brims. They were whispering. Then one of them laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the quiet. "There she is," he drawled, loud enough for me to hear every syllable. "The half-blood bookkeeper. Thought she'd marry herself a real rancher, did she?" My spine went rigid. Humiliation was a hot flush that crawled up my neck. It wasn't the first time. It was never the first time. Twice before I'd been left at the altar, left standing in a dress I'd sewn myself while the whispers slithered through the pews. "She's part savage, you know. Her mother was taken. That blood runs deep." Even when I tried to make a life for myself, opening a small library near Fort Union, the whispers followed me like my own shadow. The orphan raised by engines, untouchable. Tears welled, hot and stinging against the cold. I ducked my head, my shoulders curling in, trying to make myself smaller, invisible. I hadn't cried in front of anyone in years. I'd built walls inside me, stone by stone. But now, alone on this platform in the middle of nowhere, the walls crumbled. A single, hot tear slid down my cheek. Then another. The letter in my lap crumpled into a useless ball. That's when I heard it. Small footsteps, tapping on the wood. Tentative, but getting closer. Then a voice bright and clear as a tiny bell. "Are you hurt?" I looked up, wiping my face with the back of my sleeve. A little girl, no older than 3, stood there, staring at me with enormous, curious eyes. A wool coat, far too big for her, swallowed her small frame, and mittens dangled from a string around her neck. Golden curls, the color of spun sunlight, escaped from under her knit cap. I tried to smile, but my lips felt stiff. "No, I'm just a little sad." She studied me with the profound seriousness only a child can muster. "Did your daddy say no?" I blinked, taken aback. "No, sweetheart." She tilted her head. "Do you have a husband?" I shook my head, a small tight movement. "Do you have a baby?" Another shake. My throat felt tight. "Nobody wants me," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. The little girl took a step closer. Her mittened hand reached out and touched my gloved fingers. It was a feather-light touch, but it sent a jolt right through me. She looked me straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering, and with a certainty that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world, she asked the one question I was least prepared for. "Can you be my mommy forever?" My breath caught in my chest. The world stopped spinning. The wind held its breath. It was as if the universe had leaned in to whisper a secret directly into my soul. Before I could process the words, before I could even form a reply, a low voice spoke from behind her. A voice that sounded like gravel and whiskey and long, lonely nights. "Junie." I looked up. A man stood there. He'd approached so quietly I hadn't heard him at all. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from the Montana landscape itself, all hard lines and shadows. He was older than me, but it was a hard-won age, etched in the lines around his eyes. His coat was patched, his hat worn, his boots scuffed. In one arm he carried a small sack of flour. His other hand came to rest on the little girl's shoulder. He gave me a curt nod. "Sorry, she's got a soft heart." I scrambled to my feet, brushing down my skirt, trying to compose myself. No trouble. She just surprised me. The man's eyes, a piercing, stormy gray, flickered down to the crumpled letter still clutched in my hand. You waiting on someone? I hesitated. The truth felt like another stone in my gut. I was, but it seems I've been fooled again. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his expression unreadable. He looked down at the girl, Junie, who was now tugging on his coat sleeve. She cried, Papa. The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked back at me, his gaze sweeping over my worn bag, my tired face. You got no place to stay. It wasn't a question. No, I said, lifting my chin. But I'll manage. He just stared at me for a long moment, a silence stretching between us that felt vast and empty. The two men by the barrel had finally sauntered off, but I could still feel the phantom sting of their laughter. The wind picked up, carrying the promise of a truly bitter night. He shifted the sack in his arm. It's cold. If you want a roof and some warm broth, you're welcome to rest a while. I blinked. The offer was so unexpected, so stark. I don't even know your name. Luke, he said. Luke Harrison. He gestured down the path leading away from the town. It's not far. You can leave after supper if you still want to. I looked down at Junie, who still had a tiny, insistent grip on my fingers. Her eyes were pleading. Then I looked back at the empty platform, the endless tracks stretching into nothingness. I had nowhere else to go, nothing to lose. So I nodded. Thank you. And just like that, I followed a stranger and his daughter into the deepening Montana dusk. Not with hope. Hope was a luxury I couldn't afford. I followed him with something smaller, more fragile, the tiniest flicker of warmth, like a match struck against an overwhelming wind. I had no idea that I wasn't just walking toward a cabin. I was walking straight into the heart of a storm, into a secret that was darker and colder than the night that was falling around us. The path to Luke Harrison's cabin was a twisted ribbon of dirt that wound through skeletal pines and broken hills. The sky had bled from violet to a deep, bruised purple by the time we reached it. It wasn't much of a home, just a small one-room cabin nestled in a hollow, looking like it had grown right out of the earth. Smoke curled from a narrow stone chimney, a lonely gray flag against the darkening sky. I hesitated on the threshold. This felt wrong. Desperate. Junie, sensing my pause, tugged my hand gently. It's warm inside, she whispered, as if sharing a great secret. Luke opened the door without a word and stepped aside. The warmth hit me first, the smell of wood smoke and something savory like stew. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough plank walls. The place was sparse but clean. A single cot against the far wall, a small table with two chairs, a rocking chair. You can hang your coat there, Luke said, gesturing to a hook by the door. His voice was flat, devoid of any real welcome. I clutched my bag tighter. I won't stay long. He didn't look up from pulling off his mud-caked boots. That's up to you. I didn't invite you here to stay forever. Just the night. My cheeks flushed with heat. I was a charity case, a stray he'd brought in from the cold. I appreciate your honesty. He moved to the hearth, picked up a poker and stirred the logs. The fire hissed and spat. And for the record, he said, his back still to me, I didn't write you any letters. I froze. You're not Harlan Cololton? Luke let out a dry, humorless sound, something between a grunt and a laugh. Harlan Cololton is a 16-year-old boy who cleans stables for me sometimes, likes to play jokes with other people's mail. He finally turned, his gray eyes pinning me in place. He saw the mail order bride advertisement in the paper, thought it was a fine joke to answer it with my address. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. A joke. My last desperate hope for a life, for a place to belong, was a cruel prank concocted by a teenage boy. I stared at the floorboards, my hands clenched so tightly around my bag strap that my knuckles were white. I see, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The humiliation was so complete, so profound, it felt like I was drowning in it. Junie, sensing the sudden, sharp tension in the room, scrambled onto the bench near the fire and patted the seat beside her. You can sit here, she said, her little face earnest. It's the warmest. I moved like I was in a dream and sat down, a puppet whose strings had been cut. I didn't even take off my gloves. We ate in a silence that was louder than any argument. Luke said nothing. I said nothing. Only Junie, humming to herself as she slurped her stew, seemed immune to the suffocating awkwardness. As soon as I finished, I stood up. The broth had warmed my stomach, but not the ice in my veins. Thank you for the meal. I should go. But before I could take a single step toward the door, Junie slipped from her seat and latched onto my skirt with both hands. No, she cried, her face crumpling. You said you didn't have a house. This is one. I knelt down, my own pain forgotten in the face of hers. Sweetheart, this isn't my house. Her lower lip trembled. It can be. Just for a little. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I glanced at Luke, helpless, unsure what to do. He was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his face a mask of stone. She gets attached fast, he muttered, his voice rough. I'll sleep in the barn, I said quickly, desperate, or by the hearth, just for tonight, please. Luke didn't answer right away. He just watched me, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to read the secrets I kept locked away behind my eyes. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, he nodded. You can take the cot. I'll stay up. I felt a small wave of relief wash over me, so potent it almost made my knees buckle. As I moved to put my bag by the cot, my eyes scanned the small cabin, taking in the details I'd missed before. And that's when I saw it. Tucked away in a shadowy corner, behind a stack of neatly folded blankets, hung a small dress. It was beaded, handmade, the pattern unmistakable, the kind worn by Kiowa girls. Beside it, on a low wooden shelf, were a few carefully placed items. An eagle feather, a string of turquoise beads, a small leather pouch of dried sage. My blood ran cold. I took a step closer, my hand reaching out before I could stop myself. She was Kiowa, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Luke's voice came from right behind me, low and steady. Her name was Wayna. I spun around. He stood there, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. But he didn't flinch from my gaze. He didn't try to hide it. She died, he said, his voice flat, matter of fact. During the frost last year, fever took her fast. My heart gave a painful lurch, not of pity, of recognition, a shared, unspoken grief. I'm sorry. He didn't reply. He just turned and added another log to the fire, the flames leaping up to consume it. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with ghosts. Later, after Junie had fallen asleep, curled up beside a scruffy-looking dog I hadn't even noticed before, I sat by the window, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The moon was a silver sliver in the ink-black sky. You can stay, Luke said, his voice startling me from the darkness across the room. A few days, she's calm when you're here. I looked over at him, a silhouette in his rocking chair. All right, I won't ask for more. He gave a single, sharp nod. And that was it. Neither of us spoke again that night, but as I watched the fire burn down to glowing embers, a cold, unsettling thought began to form in my mind. A fever. That's what he'd said. But the way the dress was tucked away, the way the sacred items were placed just so, it felt like a shrine. And there was something else, something I couldn't quite place, glinting in the dark corner near the shelf. It looked like a small silver locket, half hidden under a cloth, its chain broken. Fevers don't break chains. The cabin no longer felt like a place meant for one. It felt like a place haunted by two. And I had a sudden, terrible feeling that the story of what happened to Junie's mother was far from over. It started with a shiver. One minute Junie was dancing barefoot in a patch of morning sun that streamed through the cabin window. The next she was curled on the cot, her skin flushed, her bright eyes glassy and dull. By nightfall she was burning. Her breasts came in shallow, ragged gasps, her small body trembling uncontrollably beneath a mountain of quilts. Luke hovered over her, his usual stoicism completely gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. His hands I'd seen split firewood with a single, steady swing. now shook as he tried to press a wet cloth to her burning forehead. "She's burning up," he muttered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I don't know what's wrong. It's the same. It's the same as before. The same as before." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. The same as her mother. I had been sorting the few dried herbs I carried in my bag, my own small collection of remedies. I stood quickly and crossed the room. "What happened?" "She was fine this morning," Luke said, his voice cracking. "Just a sniffle. Then she got quiet. Too quiet." I laid my hand on Junie's cheek. The heat was terrifying. It pulsed against my skin like a fire banked just beneath the surface. "She has a fever," I said, my voice much calmer than I felt. "A bad one." Luke's mouth was a tight, grim line. "We have to get her to town. To a doctor." "We can't," I said firmly. "The roads will be frozen solid by now. She wouldn't last the trip in this cold." He shot to his feet, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "Then what do we do? I can't lose her, too." I put a hand on his arm, forcing him to stop, to look at me. "I can help." He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and desperation. "How?" I took a deep breath. This was it. The part of me I kept hidden, the part that had gotten me shunned and called a savage. "My father," I said, my voice low and steady, "was a Kiowa medicine man. He taught me things that work when nothing else does." Luke's face was a war of emotions, doubt, fear, and a desperate sliver of hope. He looked from my face to his daughter's fever-ravaged form, and then back again. Finally, he gave a jerky, uncertain nod. That was all I needed. I moved with a speed and purpose that seemed to surprise him. I dug into my satchel, pulling out my precious bundles of dried roots and wrapped leaves. I set water to boil over the fire, the hiss of the kettle a sharp counterpoint to Junie's shallow breathing. I crushed bitterroot and willow bark into a thick, dark paste. My hands worked with a certainty that came from years of practice, a knowledge passed down through generations, a legacy in my blood. Luke watched from the corner, his arms crossed, his body rigid with tension. He didn't speak, but I could feel his eyes on me, tracking my every move. "She's just a child," I murmured, more to myself than to him, as I gently unbuttoned Junie's nightgown and spread the herbal paste on her small chest. "But she burns like she's carrying the weight of the world." "She's all I have," Luke said, his voice raw. I didn't answer. I just worked. I lifted Junie's head, coaxed her dry lips open, and used a small spoon to drip a bitter, steaming tea past her tongue. She whimpered and tried to turn her head away, but she swallowed. "She needs to sweat it out," I explained, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "The herbs will help her body fight. If she can break the fever before morning, she'll be all right." The cabin fell into a tense, waiting quiet. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Junie's labored breaths. Luke sat on a stool, his elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving his daughter. He looked utterly broken. "You've done this before," he said softly, his voice barely disturbing the silence. I nodded, my eyes focused on mixing another dose of tea. "Twice. A boy who had the croup so bad he couldn't breathe, and a hunter who came back from the mountains with a fever that made him see ghosts." I paused. "The hunter lived." Luke's jaw twitched. "You sound more sure of yourself than most doctors I've met." "I had to be," I said simply. "Where I grew up, no one came for us when we got sick. We had only ourselves." He studied my face then, really studied it. He saw the calm, the certainty, the gentleness in my hands as I tended to his child. And I saw something in his eyes shift. The suspicion, the hard shell he wore like armor, began to crack. He was a man who had always been the protector, the one standing guard. Tonight he was helpless. And it was me, the half-blood stranger, the unwanted woman who stood between his daughter and the same fate that had claimed his wife. I spent the night wiping Junie's forehead, replacing the compresses, forcing more tea down her throat. I whispered lullabies in the Kiowa tongue, songs my own mother might have sung, melodies of wind and stars and sacred mountains. Sometime in the deep, dark hours just before dawn, the child stirred. Her breathing, which had been a painful rasp, evened out. The violent trembling ceased. She opened her eyes. They were no longer glassy, but clear. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice faint but distinct. I froze. Luke, who had been dozing in his chair, inhaled sharply, his head snapping up. Junie's small hand reached out, fumbling, until her fingers found mine. She gripped my hand with surprising strength, a silent anchor in the dark. Then her eyes drifted closed and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. I looked at Luke, my lips parted, my heart hammering against my ribs. She doesn't understand," I stammered, trying to explain away the word that had just shattered the silence. Luke's face was cast in shadow, but when he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "She knows what feels safe." We sat there in the quiet of the cabin, the storm inside and out finally passing. Outside, frost painted silver patterns on the window panes. Inside, a little girl slept, her hand held firmly in mine, and her father watched us both, his expression one of awe and disbelief, as if he were looking at a dream too fragile to touch. He never said thank you. But in the morning when I woke, stiff and sore from my vigil by the hearth, there was a cup of coffee waiting for me on the table. It was black and strong and hot, and it had been poured just for me. As I sipped it, my gaze fell back to the corner, to the small shrine for his wife. The broken locket was still there, glinting. The fever had been broken tonight, but the mystery of the one that had come before, the one that had taken Wayna, felt colder and more present than ever. Luke's gratitude was a fragile bridge between us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was built over a chasm of secrets he had no intention of revealing. The stars were scattered across the Montana sky like cold, distant embers. A few nights had passed since Junie's fever, and a fragile peace had settled over the cabin. Fragile because it was built on unspoken things, on questions I was too afraid to ask, and answers I suspected Luke was unwilling to give. I sat on the porch step, a rough wool shawl wrapped tight around my shoulders, a mug of warm tea cradled in my hands. Junie was asleep inside, tucked into the cot, her breathing soft and even. Luke stood at the far end of the porch, his arms crossed, staring out at the dark line of trees. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy, weighted. I decided to break it. "She asked me again tonight," I said, my voice quiet. Luke turned his head slightly. "Junie?" I nodded, staring into my tea. "She wanted to know if I had a mommy. I told her I did once. A woman who sang to the stars like they were her sisters." He leaned against the railing, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. "Your real mother?" "No," I said softly. The story was so old, so worn from telling, it didn't hurt anymore. It was just a fact, like my name or the color of my eyes. "The woman who gave birth to me died the night I was born. My father was a cavalry officer. He was part of a raid. He took my mother, a Kiowa woman, left her pregnant. Some say he meant to come back for her. Others say he was just drunk on power and whiskey. It doesn't matter. I never knew him, and I don't want to." Luke was quiet, listening. "The tribe. They took me in," I continued. "An old woman, a healer they called Owl Woman. She raised me as her own. She taught me to read from discarded Bibles before I could properly ride a pony. She taught me which roots healed and which could harm. But I was always a reminder, the half-blood child, a living ghost of what had been done to them." I took a sip of tea. "When I was 17, a trader came through. He said I was too pretty to be wasting away in a teepee. He took me to a town west of here, promised me a new life." My fingers tightened around the warm mug. "The first man I was set to marry was a preacher's son. We were to be married in the spring. Then his father found out about my mother. He didn't even have the courage to tell me himself. He sent his brother to say the wedding was off." Luke said nothing, but I could feel his stillness, his attention focused solely on me. "The second wrote me letters for months. He promised me a ranch, a family, a home. But when my stagecoach arrived, he wouldn't even open his door. His mother came out onto the porch and told me he'd had a change of heart. She called me an unclean thing." I stared out into the darkness, at the ghosts of my own past. "The third one, he actually stood at the altar with me. He said the vows. He put a ring on my finger." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. He left me that night, slipped out of the hotel room before dawn, left a note on the pillow. It said he couldn't bring himself to sleep beside a woman with savage blood. The words hung in the cold night air, ugly and sharp. I stopped trying after that, I whispered. I got a job in a library. I kept to myself. I read stories to other people's children. Until I saw that advertisement. Mail order bride. It felt so foolish, so desperate. But I thought maybe, just maybe, someone out there, somewhere far away, wouldn't care about the past. They'd just see me. I looked over at him, offering a small, sad smile. Turns out it was just another cruel joke. We sat in silence for a long time. The wind whispered through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound. Then Luke spoke, his voice low and rough. I knew a man once who said blood tells the truth of a person. I glanced at him. Do you believe that? I did, Luke said, his voice dropping even lower. Then I had a daughter with skin darker than mine, with eyes that held the history of a people my own people had tried to erase. And the world told me she was less than whole. He turned his head and looked right at me, his gray eyes glinting in the faint starlight. She's the best thing I've ever done. His words were simple, but they landed in my chest like a warm stone, settling in a place that had been cold for a very long time. Your wife, Wayna, I said, testing the name on my tongue. The fever. It took her quickly? Luke's posture changed. He stiffened, his arms uncrossing as he pushed himself away from the railing. The easy quiet between us vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. Yes, he said, his voice flat and final. But I saw it. I saw the way his hand clenched into a fist at his side, the way his jaw tightened. He was lying, or at least he wasn't telling me the whole truth. My mind flashed again to the broken locket I'd seen in the corner of the cabin. Luke, I began, my heart starting to pound. When I was cleaning the other day, I found... It's late, he cut me off, his voice like chipped stone. He turned and walked back toward the cabin door, his movements stiff and deliberate. We should get some sleep. He didn't wait for my reply. He just disappeared inside, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone on the porch with the cold, the stars, and 1,000 new questions. For the first time since I'd arrived, I didn't feel like a guest. I felt like a threat. I had stumbled close to a secret he was desperate to protect, a truth buried deeper than any grave. And in that moment, sitting alone in the dark, a terrifying thought took root in my mind. What if the fever didn't kill Wayna at all? What if the real danger wasn't in my past, but living right here, under this very roof? The first snow of the season had fallen, dusting the world in a fragile layer of white. It was quiet, the kind of deep silence that only comes when the earth is holding its breath under a blanket of snow. Luke had been out since dawn checking his trap lines. I was by the hearth, stitching a patch onto one of Junie's dresses, the rhythmic pull of the needle a small comfort in the heavy silence of the cabin. He came in without a sound, the cold clinging to him like a second skin. Snow clung to his boots and dusted his broad shoulders. He looked haunted. Anything? I asked, looking up from my sewing. Rabbit, he muttered, shrugging off his heavy coat. A small one. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He hung the coat on its hook and moved to the table, pouring himself a cup of water from the bucket. He stood there, his back to me, staring out the small window at the snow-covered landscape. The tension from the other night was still there. A thin, sharp wire stretched between us. She used to sing when the snow came, he said suddenly, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I set my needle down. I knew who he meant. Weena. Her name meant quiet moon in her language, he said, his voice rough with memory. She had eyes that could laugh at you, even when her mouth was serious. A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. We met when I was 22. I was half dead from a bullet wound, delirious. She found me by the river, nursed me back to health without a word of English between us. We didn't need words. He fell silent, and I waited, not daring to breathe. When I brought her back to town, he continued, his voice hardening, they stared, they whispered. The preacher told me to my face that she'd put a spell on me, that any child we had wouldn't belong to God, that it would be an abomination. He finally turned from the window. His eyes looked 100 years old, filled with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. Last winter, I had to go for supplies. A storm was coming in, and we were low. It should have been 2 nights, but the snow was bad. It took me 3. He sat down hard in the chair, as if the weight of the memory was a physical thing, pressing him down. When I got back, the door was open. Snow had blown halfway across the floor. Junie, she was crying under the table. Just a baby. My breath caught in my throat. I could picture it. The cold, the silence, the crying child. They'd come while I was gone, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with a venomous rage. The good people of the town, led by the preacher's son, the same one you almost married. My world tilted on its axis. The preacher's son, the man who had rejected me, who had called my blood unclean. The threads of my past and his were tangled together in a terrible, violent knot. They burned her blankets. Luke's voice was flat, dead. Tore the head off Junie's doll, and they took Weena outside. His jaw locked, the muscles cording in his neck. Said they were cleansing the land. Said she was infecting the bloodline with her filth. Silence descended, thick and suffocating, a horror so profound it left no room for air. I buried her under the big cedar tree, he said, his eyes staring at something far beyond the cabin walls. And I told myself I would raise Junie alone, so quiet, so hidden, that no one could ever take anything from me again. He looked at me then, his gaze piercing. It wasn't a fever that took her, Clara. It was hate. The broken locket, the shrine, his lies. It was all to protect himself, to protect Junie. Not from a memory, but from the people just a few miles down the road. People who could smile at you on Sunday and become monsters by moonlight. I understand, I whispered, my hands clenched in my lap. He let out a long, shuddering breath. I didn't come here to find a wife, he said, his voice raw. I came here to disappear. I didn't come here to fall in love either, I found myself saying, the words surprising me. I just wanted a place where I didn't have to apologize for who I am. We just looked at each other then, not as a man and a woman, but as two survivors. Two people who had been scarred by the same kind of hatred, who had chosen silence as a shield. She would have liked you, Luke said after a long moment, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. A small, sad smile touched my lips. She made a beautiful daughter. She was the strongest person I ever met, he said. I looked down at the patched dress in my hands. Then I'll make sure her daughter grows up knowing that. Junie murmured something in her sleep from the cot, a soft, childish sound that broke the spell between us. Luke stood and moved toward her, pausing at the doorway. He turned back to me. You don't have to stay, he said, his voice low. I know. But if you do, he continued, his gaze holding mine, you don't owe me anything. This isn't a transaction. I'm not here to be owed, I replied softly. I'm just here. Another silence fell, but this one didn't ache. It settled around us like a warm blanket. We hadn't said the word love. We hadn't even come close. But something had taken root in the space between our shared stories, something fragile but persistent. And as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world and muffling all sound, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. But it was a fool's peace, because the evil that had taken Weena wasn't buried under a cedar tree. It was alive and well, and it had already noticed me. It was watching, and it was waiting. The wind had shifted by mid-afternoon. It was colder, sharper, with the teeth of a blizzard in its bite. I had just finished hanging a blanket to dry near the hearth when a sudden, chilling quiet fell over the cabin. The kind of quiet that means something is wrong. Junie? No answer. Junie, are you hiding? I called, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Only the hiss of the fire and the moan of the wind outside. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I dropped the blanket and ran to the door, flinging it open. The yard was empty, a pristine sheet of white. But the gate near the tree line, the one Luke always kept latched, stood wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up my throat. Junie! I ran, not even bothering to grab my coat, my boots sinking into the fresh snow. I called her name over and over, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. I found her footprints first, small indentations leading away from the cabin toward the woods. But they weren't alone. Alongside them was another set, larger, a man's boots. My blood ran cold. He'd come back. The preacher's son. His name was Elias. I followed the tracks, my breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. They led down toward the creek, which was running high and fast with melted snow, its edges crusted with ice. I saw a flash of red snagged on a thorn bush, a ribbon from Junie's hair, and then I heard it, a splash, and a scream of pure terror. Junie! I broke through the trees and saw them. Junie was in the water, the icy current pulling her downstream, her small hands flailing, trying to grab onto a branch just out of her reach. And on the bank stood Elias, his face twisted in a righteous sneer. He wasn't even trying to help her. He was just watching. This is a cleansing, he shouted at me, his eyes wild with fanaticism. Ridding this land of your filth, just like we did with the other one? There was no time to think, only to act. Hold on, Junie, I screamed, tearing off my shawl as I ran. The water was a physical blow, a blade of pure winter that stabbed into my skin, my muscles, my bones. It stole the air from my lungs. I gasped, stumbling on the slippery rocks of the creek bed. But I kept moving, my eyes locked on Junie. I reached her, grabbing her under the arms, my fingers numb and clumsy. I've got you, sweetheart, I grunted, heaving her toward a large, half-submerged rock. Climb up. Hold on tight. She sobbed, her small body trembling violently, but she clung to the rock. I had pushed her to safety, but in doing so, my own foot had slipped, wedging itself between two large underwater stones. I was trapped. I pulled. I twisted. A sharp, searing pain shot up my leg, from my ankle to my hip. The current was relentless, pulling at me, trying to drag me under. My arms burned from the cold, my strength draining away with every passing second. Elias just stood on the bank, a dark silhouette against the snow, a phantom from my past come to destroy my future. The devil claims his own, he said, his voice calm and steady. The cold was winning. My vision began to tunnel. Black spots danced in front of my eyes. The last thing I saw was Junie's small, pale face, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. Then the world and all its pain went dark. I don't know how long I was under. It could have been seconds or an eternity. The next thing I knew, there was shouting, a different voice, a roar of pure primal rage. Luke. He must have come back early. He must have seen the tracks. I felt strong arms haul me from the water, my head lolling back. Through a blurry haze, I saw him. He didn't even have a coat on. He laid me on the snowy bank and then waded back into the churning creek, pulling a terrified, sobbing Junie from the rock and carrying her to safety. Then he turned to face Elias. I had only ever seen the quiet, grieving side of Luke Harrison. The man who faced the preacher's son was someone else entirely. He was a force of nature, a storm of fury that had been held back for far too long. You, Luke snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. You came back. Elias took a step back, his smug confidence finally faltering. She's a witch. I saw her. She did some devil's ritual on your child. I was saving her. You were trying to kill her, Luke said, his voice dropping even lower. Just like you killed my wife. He moved faster than I would have thought possible. He closed the distance between them in two long strides. There was a sickening crunch of bone on bone. Elias crumpled to the ground, clutching his face. Luke stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. For a second, I thought he was going to kill him. I saw a year of suppressed rage, grief, and hatred boiling to the surface. But then he looked over at us, at Junie, huddled and shivering, at me, lying half-conscious in the snow. And the fury in his eyes subsided, replaced by a fierce, desperate protectiveness. He turned his back on Elias, scooped me up into his arms as if I weighed nothing, and grabbed Uni's hand. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you. I've got you both." As he carried me back toward the cabin, the world began to fade again. But before I slipped away completely, I heard him whisper, his voice breaking on the words, "Stay with me, Clara. Please don't leave me too." The fire roared, a blazing beast fighting back the cold that had settled deep in my bones. I was wrapped in every dry blanket Luke owned, cocooned in a mountain of wool and cotton. Vaguely, I remembered him stripping off my wet, frozen clothes, his hands trembling but surprisingly gentle, his gaze carefully averted. He didn't see me as a woman's body then. He saw me as a life flickering, about to be extinguished. He held me close, his own body warmth a desperate furnace against my icy skin. "Stay with me, Clara," he whispered over and over, his voice a raw, broken prayer. "Come back. Please don't leave me." Junie was asleep nearby, warm and safe now in the cot, her small fingers curled tightly around the edge of my old shawl. She hadn't let it go. Luke didn't sleep. He stayed awake the entire night, a tireless sentinel. He fed the fire, he rubbed warmth back into my numb hands and feet, and he kept whispering those same words as if by sheer force of will he could call my spirit back from the brink. He did not cry, but there was a fracture in his voice, a sound of something shattering that was more devastating than any tear. By morning I stirred. My eyelids felt heavy, glued shut. I forced them open. The cabin was dim, the world a blurry, unfocused thing. Then his face swam into view. He was kneeling beside me, his own face haggard, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a terrifying vulnerability. "Junie," was the first word I managed, my voice a dry, scratchy rasp. "She's safe," Luke whispered, his hand coming up to brush a damp strand of hair from my forehead. His touch was hesitant, gentle. "She's safe because of you." I swallowed, the effort painful. My whole body ached with a deep, shuddering chill I couldn't seem to shake. I couldn't let him have her. "I know," he said, and his voice cracked. "You didn't." His hand trembled as it rested on my cheek. "You saved my daughter, Clara. You could have died." I looked at him, really looked at him, for a long, silent moment. I saw the fear in his eyes, the terror of being left alone again, the ghost of his wife's murder playing out right before him. "I'd do it again," I whispered. His head bowed, his forehead coming to rest against my own. He was so close I could feel the warmth of his breath, see the moisture gathering in his lashes. For a moment he couldn't speak. He just breathed, a shaky, ragged sound. Then so softly it was almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire, he said it again. "Don't ever leave again, Clara. Don't. Please." It wasn't a request. It was a plea from a man who had walled his heart in stone and had just watched those walls get blasted to rubble. My hand, weak and trembling, lifted from the blankets. My fingers found his, curling around them. It was a faint touch, but it was enough. "I wasn't planning to," I said. And for the first time, I knew he wasn't just looking at a woman who had shown up by mistake. He was looking at someone who had chosen to stay, someone who had fought for his child, someone who had already, without a single word being spoken, become part of the very fabric of his life. He was looking at his home. As the morning light began to filter through the window, I drifted off again, but this time it was a healing sleep. And as I went under, a single crazy thought popped into my head. The preacher's son, Elias, had been left broken in the snow. The town would have to react. The story wasn't over. This small cabin, our tiny sanctuary, was about to become the center of a war, and I had no idea if we were strong enough to win. When I truly awoke, the cabin was filled with the soft gray light of late afternoon. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long, sleepy shadows along the log walls. The first thing I saw was Junie. She was sitting quietly on the floor by my side, holding a little rag doll in one hand, just watching me, waiting. The moment my eyes opened and focused on her, her face lit up like the dawn. "Clara!" she cried out, a sound of pure joy. She scrambled up onto the cot, her small body moving with a careful urgency, and wrapped both her arms around my neck. "You woke up!" I was still weak, my body a collection of aches and pains. But I hugged her back, burying my face in her sun-gold hair. "Sweetheart." She pulled back just enough to look me right in the eyes, her expression deadly serious. And then she asked the same question she had asked on that cold, lonely train platform, the question that had started everything. "Can you be my mommy forever?" This time I didn't hesitate. I didn't flinch. The world didn't stop. Instead, it clicked perfectly into place. I pulled the child close again, holding her so tightly I could feel her little heart beating against my own. My arms shook, not from cold or weakness, but from the overwhelming weight of something I had never, ever allowed myself to want. Tears, hot and cleansing, slipped down my cheeks. "Yes," I whispered into her hair, the word a sacred vow. "Yes, baby. If you'll have me, I will." Junie nodded fiercely against my shoulder, a solemn, binding agreement, and then she snuggled down under the blanket beside me, fitting perfectly into the curve of my body. I held her as if she had been born from my own heart. From the doorway, Luke stood silent. He had heard it all. He didn't move, didn't interrupt the moment. He just watched, his face a mixture of emotions too profound for words. Only when Junie's breathing had deepened into the soft rhythm of sleep did he turn and step outside into the cold. After a while, I carefully slid out from under the blankets, tucking them snugly around the sleeping child. I wrapped myself in the heavy wool shawl and stepped out onto the porch. My bare feet made soft sounds on the cold wooden planks. Luke was standing with his back to me, his hands gripping the railing, his head bowed. His breath came in pale, misty clouds in the frigid air. I came to stand beside him. We didn't speak at first, just stood there, sharing the vast, silent twilight. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I ain't much for speeches," he said, his voice rough. "And I ain't got much. Not like other men." I watched his profile, waiting. "I didn't send that letter," he continued, his gaze fixed on the distant, snow-covered hills. "Didn't plan for any of this. For you." "I know," I said softly. He hesitated, a rare uncertainty in his movements. His hand came up to rake through his dark hair, a nervous gesture that seemed so out of place on this hardened, stoic man. "But when I saw you pull her from that water, when I heard what you just said to her," he finally turned to face me, his gray eyes searching mine in the dying light. "I don't have silver rings or a preacher's vows. I've got this porch, a fire that doesn't always stay lit, a fence that needs mending." He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the stillness. "But if what you want is a place to stay, if what you need is to not be alone, then I've got that. I've got this. I've got her." His voice dropped, becoming thick with emotion. "And I want to have you too, if you'll let me." My heart felt like it was going to beat its way right out of my chest. My throat ached with all the things I wanted to say, all the years of loneliness and fear I wanted to release. But all that came out was his name, a single, breathless word. "Luke." He looked down, misinterpreting my silence as rejection, bracing himself for the blow. I reached out and took his hand. It was calloused and rough, but so incredibly warm. "I don't want just a porch," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "or a roof, or just someone who lets me stay." My fingers squeezed his. "I want a family." Luke's eyes, when he lifted them back to mine, were filled with a light I had never seen before, a light that chased away all the shadows. Just then, the cabin door creaked open and Junie tumbled out, barefoot and wearing only her little nightgown. She must have woken up and found us gone. She blinked in the cold, saw us standing together, holding hands, and her face broke into a gigantic, sleepy grin. "My mommy and my papa!" she shouted, her voice ringing with delight. She spun in a little circle, her arms flung wide, laughing as the first flakes of evening snow began to fall, touching her face like tiny kisses. Luke bent down and scooped her up in one smooth motion, settling her on his hip between us. I wrapped my arms around them both, pulling them into a messy, heartfelt hug. And in that moment, under the falling snow, on the porch of a tiny, broken-down cabin in the middle of nowhere, we stopped being three separate, broken people. We became one whole thing, a family, forged not by letters or laws, but by fire and ice and a love that had refused to die. The wind that swept across the plains a year later carried a different scent. Not the sharp bite of winter, but the sweet, earthy smell of dry sage and autumn grass. I stood in the doorway of our cabin, one hand resting on the gentle, round swell of my belly. Our second child, a son, was due any day. Behind me, Junie's laughter echoed through the house. It was a sound that had become the melody of our lives. We had made a home, not just a shelter, but a rhythm. Luke had added a second room over the summer, its fresh-cut pine still smelling sweet. He'd built shelves for my growing collection of drying herbs and glass jars filled with salves and tinctures. A small, hand-carved sign now hung above the door. Harrison and Ray, herbs and help. Elias, the preacher's son, had been sent away. When Luke carried me back to the cabin that day, he hadn't left Elias for dead. He'd tied him up and delivered him to the sheriff in the next county over, along with the story of what he'd done to Wayna a year before, and what he'd just tried to do to Junie. There was no trial. The preacher, shamed and broken, sold his land and moved his family east before the ground thawed. The town, faced with the ugliness it had allowed to fester in its heart, fell quiet. Their acceptance of us was slow. It didn't come with apologies. It came in small, quiet gestures. It started with the children who, drawn by Junie's laughter, would come to the edge of our property, curious and shy. I started teaching them their letters, using charcoal on scraps of wood. Then their mothers started coming, knocking softly on our door, asking in hushed tones for a remedy for a child's cough, a salve for a burn, a tea to help an old man's aching knees. They never mentioned my blood. They just called me Miss Clara, and they meant it. Luke watched it all with a quiet, steady pride. He never said much to the townsfolk, but he started leaving a sharpened axe for a neighbor, or a small bundle of cured meat on a widow's porch. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was no longer born of grief. It was born of peace. And today, under a sky streaked with gold and amber, we were getting married. There was no church, no preacher, just a wide open field, a handful of our neighbors who had once whispered about us, in the sycamore tree where Junie had first danced in the snow. I wore a simple dress of soft brown cotton I'd sewn myself. My hair was in a long braid, a single hawk feather tied near the end, just as Owl Woman had taught me. Luke waited for me under the tree, looking impossibly handsome and impossibly nervous. Junie, grinning from ear to ear, ran ahead of me, scattering wildflower petals from a small basket. When I reached him, Luke took both of my hands in his. They were trembling. This man, who had faced down hatred and death without flinching, was undone by this simple moment. "I don't have rings," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion, "and I don't have a name that's ever meant safety to anyone." I squeezed his hands. "I don't need safety," I said, my voice clear and strong for all to hear. "I just need home." I looked from his shimmering gray eyes to the smiling face of the little girl who had called me mommy when I was a ghost on a platform. I used to be a woman no one chose, a bride no one sent for. But today, I smiled, today I am a wife, and I am a mother. He leaned in and kissed me, a kiss that tasted of autumn air and forever. That night, as a full moon rose over the plains, my labor began. Luke was by my side the entire time, his hand a steady anchor in mine. And when the time came, he caught our son with the same strong hands that had built our home. He held the baby close, his face wet with tears I never thought I'd see him shed. He looked at me, his eyes full of a love so powerful it lit up the entire room. "You are not a mail-order bride," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. "You are my choice. Every single day, you are my choice." He laid our son in my arms, and the baby, with a thatch of dark hair just like his father's, nuzzled against my chest. The next morning, Junie tiptoed into the room. She climbed carefully onto the bed and stared, wide-eyed, at the tiny swaddled bundle. "Come meet your brother," I said softly. She leaned in and planted a gentle, solemn kiss on the baby's cheek. Then she looked up at me, her little face serious. "Mama," she asked, her voice a small whisper, "you picked me, right?" My heart squeezed. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She touched the baby's tiny curled fist. "He was born in your tummy, but you still picked me. Just like him, like Daddy picked you. I gathered both of my children into my arms, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. Yes, I said, kissing the top of her golden head. Yes, I chose you, and Daddy chose me. And now, we all get to choose each other, every day. Nobody gets left behind here. Not anymore. Outside, Luke was humming as he tended the garden. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. He glanced up at the window and saw us all there, a family, whole and complete. He smiled. And in that quiet, perfect moment, I knew. This was a life no one could ever take from me, because it wasn't a life that was given. It was a life that was built. Built on the rubble of heartbreak and watered with tears. Yes, but built with a love strong enough to withstand any storm. It was real. It was ours. And it was forever. If you enjoyed this story of hope and finding family in the most unexpected of places, do me a favor. Hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove even the loneliest hearts can find a home. And let me know in the comments, what do you think is the true meaning of family? I'd love to read your thoughts. Thanks for listening.